This is what we're talking about. Is there a right or a wrong answer when it comes to using Flexbox or Grid? I mean, at the end of the day, they're kind of the same thing. You are working with containers. What differentiates them is the layout or the approach you might take. Now, before I jump straight into looking at Grid, and this is a bit of a crash course, I want to revisit the Flexbox containers because believe it or not, when you are using the Grid, if you're trying to be a bit more inventive, especially when you're adding elements in, you're going to be reusing containers or flex boxes within the grid as well. But I just want to re-explore quick crash course on Flexbox containers because it's going to help you to understand when you may or may not want to use the grid. And if it wasn't already obvious, we are using Elementor, and I have already got a pre-built structure with lots of containers and grids towards the end, and you can use the timeline to jump and look at the different features that we're going to cover off today. But I do want to cover it in a methodical way just so that you understand. So let's just go down to our very first container. By the way, I've got headings on here and I have added in some CSS. So every time I add in a container, we get a bit of a border outline just so that you understand, so that when I do have parent and child containers, you're actually going to see the outline. So you will now know, is that a container? So over here, we have a flex container. So when you first use Elementor and you've activated the Flexbox container, you can activate the grid feature as well because we are going to cover it. But let's just say you're just using Flexbox container. You will be presented with something like this, okay? It'll be empty, and when you hit the plus sign, you get to pick various options. Now, if you're going to go flex, you pick flex. If you're going to go grid, you pick grid. But like I said, we're going to cover the grid later on. When you click Flexbox, you get some options. So you could have a standard single column container, or you could have one as a row. Don't worry, we're going to go through all of this. Or you could have a parent container with two child containers. Again, we're going to explore that later on. But you have various options here, so you may want to be a bit inventive. This, in a way, is very similar to a grid container or a grid box containing 6 containers. But what you would get if you click that is 1 parent container and 6 child containers. Now, if this is all blowing your mind with parent container, child container, we haven't got onto the grandchild or the subchild container yet, don't worry, we are going to go through this in a very methodical, slow-fashioned way. But it won't be so slow-fashioned that it blows your mind. So this down here is what you would have got if I had clicked this. So you will now get 1 container. You can see the border outline there. Let's just go and get rid of it because I'm going to use the one that I've already prepared earlier because I've gone and dropped some things into it. Now, inside of this container, you can see that we have a heading, we have an icon, and we have a button. Everything is stacked atop one another. Basically, they're flowing in a column because this is a flex column. Remember over here, when I picked Flexbox, I went and picked the one with the arrow pointing down. If I had picked the direction row with the arrow going to the right, you would have seen a different layout, and we will look at that later. This pre-built container also has some padding applied of 20 pixels. So I'm just giving you a clue. I'm not going to repeat this every time we move to a different stage of this tutorial. So that you can see here, I've got padding of 20 and the height of my container is currently 250 pixel, okay? And it's just set as a full width. What we want to focus on is the fact that the heading, the icon, and the button are stacked atop one another. If I click on the container over here, you will again see that the column is vertical. If I was to use the column reversed, can you see now that everything has switched? If you drop some items in and you want to switch them around, you can do. You can also convert this straight into a row as well, but we'll cover that when we get to the next section. Over here, we have justified content. This is a 250 pixel height container. You could have made it full height if you want, or made it even smaller. At the moment, this is set to be in the center. If I click stop, it goes to the top, end goes to the bottom. Let's pop it back in the center, just so that you understand how that looks. Space between, can you see what it did there? It pushed the heading and the butter to the edges of the container. Now, they're not going all the way to the full edge line, because remember, this container, if we go to the advanced tab, has 20 pixel padding. You set that's 0, you can see what it's doing. Let's pop that back to be 20. We could also go for space around or space evenly. Now let's go to the align items, and I think you can guess what we're doing here. If we click start, it's at the start. Now, if I hover over these, can you see that the width of these are kind of set to be the width of the element? If we go to the center, it will be center. Again, it's the width of the element. If we go to end, it goes all the way to the end. And again, we are still set to be the width of the element. If, however, you do stretch, the width is now stretching. So look at the icon, the heading, and the button. See the pink line there? It's stretching across the width. If we click on the container and I go and drop in another brand new button, it goes directly below. And if I drop in another one, it goes below. Now, even though I went and set this container to be 250 pixel in height, it still maintains that there, but every time you add in further items, it's going to make the container bigger. So you may find that if you are being very prescriptive over the height, just be aware that your height will grow if you start to add in further items. What if you're using the Flexbox container, but you want one of your items to actually be in the center or say on the far right or some other positioning inside of your parent container? Let's go and take this icon. At the minute, this parent container, everything is aligned to the start. That would be center, but it's aligned to the start. If I now go and click on my icon and go to style and I start to mess around here, it's not going to move. One thing you could do is you could go and set your align items for your container to be stretched like that, because now it's taking up the full width. Then click on the icon and you could now center it like that. But you may not want to do this. So let me just go back to my container and put everything back to be on the start. Instead, I'm going to click on the icon, go to the advanced tab, and over here we have align self. And if I now click end, can you see it goes to the end? Or we could put it in the middle as well. So you do have this option in the advanced tab for every single element where you're almost breaking out of the rules a little bit. So this is not stretched container. Everything is aligned to the start. But I can position that icon to be in the middle. That was the flex column. Okay, it's really, really simple. Every time you add in an item, it's going to stack below it. Let's now go on to the flex row. So let's just click on the container. So this now is where the arrow is going to the right. And you can see it over there. There's the direction. I just have a heading, an icon, and a button. If I click on the parent container, I could reverse it and we could have it going the other way around. And the logic behind this is that if I was to go drop in another button, it goes and sits afterwards. And you might go, hey, this is really, really cool. But there does come a downside to this. I've added in a text editor and we're going to drop in another one. And can you see what's happening? The more we add, it starts to cramp up a little bit and things start to overlap and it just starts to get really, really messy. Don't worry, I'll show you how we can sort that out when we get onto Flex Row Wrap. Now, again, please do use the timeline if this is too slow or you kind of know all of this and you just wanted to jump straight to the grid aspect of it, use the timeline. And don't forget to check out our $1 business packs. And we've got a load of free packs as well. Go and click the link in the video description. The settings for the container when you're in row mode is not that dissimilar from column. It's just reverse the other way around. So we are currently set to be a row. I've already shown you the reverse. We're currently centered. You go for start, you go for end, you go for space between, you got space around, and you got space evenly. I prefer to use either start, center, end, or space between. Align items, we're currently in the center. We now go start, we go end, or you could stretch it. And again, it's the same kind of logic. Can you see if I hover over every single icon or element there? It now takes up the full height of this particular container. If we'd gone for start, you now see the pink line is only over the button, so that's the ultimate height of it. If we pop it back onto center and I go and say click on the heading, I could go to the advanced tab and I can now move that to the end or move it to the top. I just wanted to jump straight to the advanced tab because we covered that off late in the column, but I'm just showing you it's really simple and easy to understand once you start to play around with the containers. Again, we have the gaps. We could zero that all out. So now items are close together. I mean, if you weren't going to touch the row because everything was side by side, you could just touch the column. So if I go and set 60, we'll have a 60 gap there. I'm going to pop it back to be 20 and 20 for the column and the row. Now, here's where the wrap functionality becomes really, really interesting. I'm going to go and pop back in all of those text editors. So we've got this huge, ugly cramp effect going on at the moment. But if I now go and hit wrap, watch what happens. Can you see that? We have our original 3 items still occupying like the first line, But now everything else, which was quite long, the text editors, they're wrapping onto their own individual lines. We can modify this to suit what we want. But this is where the wrap feature really kicks in. When you do activate the wrap, you do have these other options down here, but I'm going to show you that when we look at the wrap more properly, which we're going to do right now. So this is the Flex Row wrap. And again, you can see this is still just one parent container at the moment. I've shown you how if we had loads and loads of items in, I could start wrapping them so that what doesn't fit or what starts to cramp up would now go onto its separate line. But what if I want the heading to be on its own line and I want the icon and button to be below? Because a row, everything stacks side by side. We've already seen the column where it stacks top to bottom or the other way around if you reverse. But I now want the heading to be on its own line. You've gone over to where you have wrap and you would set it to wrap. Well, nothing moved. The reason being is because these are actually quite small items. And we've got all of this space on the right-hand side. So why would it wrap it? It's going to look at it and go, well, the widths are quite reasonable, so there's no need to wrap it. Well, here's what you could do. I could go to my heading, and where we have the width in the Advanced tab for the heading, I could now set it to be full width. And because that is now full width, and you can see the pink outline there, it pushes everything else to the next row below. Now, don't worry about the space here. I'm going to address that in a moment. I could, if I want, also set the heading to be a custom width. So watch this. As I increase it, it moves everything along. But my icon and my button are still there. But what if I go to something like that? The icon has not moved because I'm not taking up the full width. And it's not until I hit, say, 96% or 100% would be better. That's when it moves on to the next line. So let's just go and pop that to be 100% like that. Let's now go to the icon. That is on the same line as the button. I could again go to the Advanced tab, go to width, I could either go to custom, or I could just make it be full width. And obviously the icon just needs a bit of adjustment and stick it on the left, but I've made it be a full width. So looking at that, if it did not say Flex Row Wrap, you might look at that from the get-go and go, yeah, that's a column container, it's stacking top to bottom. It's not. It's a row with a wrap and full width for some of those elements to push him onto the next line. Let's go and set this back to be default so we've got them on the same line now with the button. There's a bit of an ugly space there at the moment. Remember, if we go to my container, this is set to be centered. So you hit top and it moves it up, but there's still this gap. We go end, there's still a gap. You go stretch, there's still this ugly big gap. I made that heading 100%. I never said make the height be ultra huge, so why have I got this going on? This is an effect of wrapping that you can easily sort out. So let's just go and pop everything back to be center. Let's click on the container. Make sure you're always on the container, which it was anyway. Do you remember I said that the minute you go and hit wrap earlier, you have this align content kick in? And at the moment, it is set to be default. If I go and hit center, watch the screen. It now brings everything back to be in the center. If I was to go and hit start, it would now move it to the top. Basically, if you start messing around with anything here, all it's going to do is start adjusting how these items are aligned. And I know a lot of people, they spend a lot of time messing around here, and then they go into each element and they start to do negative bottom margins or top margins to try and bring things closer. This is the feature you need to use. If we go end, it goes end, space between, around. You can see that, and we have the evenly as well. But I'm just going to pop that back into center. And that's how simple and easy it is. And if I was to just go and make this be full width, look, again, like I said, you're going to think that is exactly the same as what we've got over there. Wouldn't you? I mean, that's your flex column, right? Look at that for a moment. And then we go down to Flex Row Wrap. Same padding. Height 250 pixel. That's basically the same thing, but we've done different features and different options. That's how cool Flex Row Wrap is. I hope this is making sense. I look forward to your comments. Now we're going to move on to child containers. So everything's been done in one parent container. Every time you drop in your elements, they all sit within the parent container. Then maybe you want to go for some more bespoke or particular layout. And this is where adding in child containers now allow you to add elements individually into separate child containers that sit inside a parent container. It's a bit like thinking of sections and columns, or section and boxes and containers and boxes and divs. Dun, 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 dun. Don't get scared. It is far simpler than it looks. We have a parent container. See the big dotted dashed outline. And inside of there, we have 3 child containers. And I'm telling you about the whip, so I'm giving away a little bit of what we're going to be doing. But we have a parent container and 3 child containers. Let me now show you the multiple ways that you could have got the child containers in the first place. If we click the plus sign Flexbox, over here we have some layouts where you already have a parent container with 2 child containers. This is a parent again with 2 child containers, but there's a slightly different width. This has got 4 child containers. Let's just go for this one for a moment. This is the first child container. It's set to be content width 100 full width. Always make sure it's full width. If you have it set as boxed, it doesn't work properly when you start to mess around with it. Always make sure the child container is a full width. I'm going to go and decrease this to be 35%. Here is the second child container, and this is currently set to 50. So if this is 35 and I make that 65, that is now 100% within the width. But what if I was to go and set this to be 20 like that? And I now want to add in another child container, and you can actually see it over here. There's our parent, and there's our 2 child containers sat inside. It's always a good thing to go and rename them so that you don't get confused maybe with which one is the parent and which are the child, or maybe child container is for testimonials and child container number 2 is for images or content or blurb. I could, if I want, go and duplicate this container. So I've got a 35, a 20%, and another 20%. Or I could go and add in a container here. So I'm going to click on my parent container, go to the plus sign, drop in another container. Now, at the moment, this parent container is set to be a row because that's what it kind of does by default. But we are going to be looking at the column child containers in a moment. But I just want to show you that you can add items in. So either use one that's pre-built, or go and drop your items in, and then you can start messing around with the width of them. Let me just get rid of that, and let's now focus on the flex column child. So here we have our parent container. This parent container has got 20 pixel padding, as you can see. And then into here, I've gone and dropped in 3 child containers. So each time you add in a child container, they're going to stack atop one another. So if I click on here, click the plus sign and drop in another container, you will have seen a 4th container has now appeared. They keep stacking atop one another, but you'll notice the containers are all different widths. Well, I've already shown you that like moments ago. This container is 100%, this container is 60%, and this one over here is 25%. Again, I've kind of told you that above here, so you should be pretty obvious. Each one of these containers, and this is why child containers can be massively your friend. If you expand on each one of them, they all contain a heading, an icon, and a button. So why would you even go for this approach? Well, let's just think about this. The very first child container is already defaulting to be a column. It defaults to be a column. It tends to happen that way. But I could click on this icon, go to the advanced tab, and now set that to be in the middle. And the second child container, I could go and change the height to be, say, 350, made it a lot bigger. I could position it to be at the end. I could go and click on my heading and send that to the top there. Basically, everything we've been doing above, let's just pop this to be at the top like that. You can mess around with it because you're now working within your own container. So you've got a parent container where you may have a particular layout. I mean, I could click on this container, go to the advanced tab for the child container and align it to be at the end. Look at the layout we've got going on here. This is a parent container set as a column with 3 child containers. And I mean, look, let me just make a point here, okay? I'm going to go to this child container. We're going to make it be 60% width, and I'm now going to go and set this to be a row. That layout, would you have even started considering or thinking of the possibility of doing stuff like this? The flexibility and the options you have. And you can have a background image for this container or even a color. Let's just go and pick a color. Sorry, I did that on the child container. Make sure you're on the right parent container. And we're going to go pick a color like that. Now that is going to color everything as well because I've not set the colors for my child containers except for the bottom one. So I'm going to go and set this one to be a white. You can start to have some really bespoke styling with your imagination or the design brief that you're working with. That was the flex column child. And when we move on to the flex row wrap child, it's kind of now following on the logic we've already done. So what we have is a parent container with 3 child containers. You can see them there: child container 1, child container 2, child container 3. If we go and click on this, it's currently set to be a row and it is wrapping. Let me take off the wrap. So when you take off the wrap, you will get this. Every time you add in a new container, and for the sake of it, I'm just going to go and duplicate this, it's just going to start to basically add containers, and there will come a point where eventually things are going to start to get crazy, like the button, or things cramp up or start leaking out. Let's just undo all of that. And again, like what I said above, if you wanted to, you could go and set your individual child containers to be columns, rows, reverse row. You can have a wrap inside of a child container. You can add a container into another container. So this container already contains heading, icon, and button. I'm going to drop in another container and I'm going to drop a button into here. And I could have different styling. So my parent container could be a column. My child container could be a row. And I could have another child container or a subchild or a grandchild inside of the child container. That could be a column again. Think methodically about your design, because I'm going to show you in a moment how you could overuse a lot of child containers when you didn't have to. I'm going to activate the wrap. And the reason why child container 1 is taking up the full width is because if I go to it and I click on the width, you can see it is set to 100%. And as I move it, child container 2 will appear. And if I shrink it down even more, you will eventually get to a point where child container 3 appears. But you got to think about the size of your elements. Let's just pop that back to be 100%. If we go to the second one, it is set to be 60%. If we go to the third one, it is set to be 25%. If I had gone with 40, it follows onto the other line. And you're going to be wondering now, but hold on, 60 plus 40 is 100%. Why has it gone to the other line? Let's just go back over to my parent container. And what I'm going to tell you now applies everywhere where you've got a bit of wrap or where you've got things side by side. This parent container has gap of 20. So even though we got 60% and we got 40%, that 20 over there is going to push it over. So if I change this to be 0, that is now 60 plus 40. If I go and add in literally just 1% to either the column or the row, it pushes it. Can you see we have a bit of a gap appear there? It's a tiny gap, and it's probably better if I make it a bit bigger. But just by adding in 1%, not 1%, 1 pixel, it's pushed it over, because 60% plus 40% is 100 plus 1 pixel. Well, that's gone beyond the 100% parameters now. So what you could do is add in your 20 pixels for your column and your row, and then just go over and shrink these down a little bit like that. So that is now 59 and that is 39. And then go back over to my parent container and I'm going to set it to be space between. So it now fully occupies the gap that we have over there, because there was a little bit of a gap and it was a little bit bigger than I really wanted it to be. So if you ever find that issue, just play around a little bit with your gaps and understand that percentages plus the column or the row gap can exceed your 100%. But the main point of this is that we've got child containers and I am now wrapping them, and I can add whatever I want into it. I can align the items, go to the advanced tab, you can move things around. And now let me address a little bit of the overuse of child containers. So down here, we have the exact same copy of what we had above, except we don't have an icon and a button over here. So there it is for child container 3. What we have in this parent container is a parent container, child container 1, which is set to be 100% in width. And we have got the row activated as well. And then we've got child container 2, which is set to be 60%. I wanted to have a heading. Now, what you might have done is dropped in another child container, and then you would have dropped in your heading, and you might have made it a certain width or whatever. Sorry, you add in your third child container like what you have here, and then you go and drop in a heading element or a text editor, and then you would set up your width. Well, because you're using the wrap, you don't actually have to pop this particular heading into a child container. Because every time you add in an element, it's going to sit side by side unless you do a bit of wrap to push it to the next row. So if you are just going to have a heading, you don't need a child container. You could just drop in a text editor or an image or something. So have a think about how many child containers you need, because each time you add one, you are adding in a bit more coding and DOM that's got to be rendered. And it is just a container at the end of the day. But if you are very mindful about excessive bloat, then don't overuse child containers unless you need to. Let me just clarify. We had a child container here because I got 3 elements inside. But if I was only ever going to add 1 element to the right of it, then I don't need to do this. And if I click on my heading, go to the Advanced tab, this is currently set to be Start, Center, End. And if I go for Stretch, remember what it does? It stretches the height. Look at that. But if you wanted your text to be in the middle, unless you were going to go and add in lots of breakpoints or carriage returns, that's where the child container would be your friend. Because if I was to now get rid of the icon and everything there and go to the child container, I could now center that. So you just have to think about placements and like, how do you want it to look? And do you or do you not need a child container? Because here's another example. And yeah, we are going to get onto the grid. This video is becoming super massively huge, but I really feel like you need to understand this because a lot of what you do here is kind of going to be repeated to an extent inside of your grid as well. So this is an example of a parent container, and we've got lots of child containers here. We got child container 1. This is set to be 30%, and I've added in a background color or a gradient to the first child container. It's currently set to be a column so that if I wanted to add anything into here, they would now stack a bit like what we got here. So let me just get rid of that. We have child container number 2. Remember, everything sits side by side because it's a row. And inside of this child container, we have a text. We've got some further text. In fact, we've got 3 bunches. Because this container is set to be a row and it's got wrapping on, one of the text editors, which has been set to be full width, takes up the full width of that child container. And then I've got 2 further text editors where I've gone and set the width to be 60% and 30%, which is why we're getting a bit of a gap there. If I'd made it be 40% or maybe 39%, they'd be a bit closer because I've got a bit of a column gap inside of this child container. You can see it there. I hope you're following through. So parent container, child container 1, which is whatever I set it at 30%, and it's just got a background image. Child container 2, which is set to be 70%, so it fills up the rest of the space, and it contains some text editors, and again, the wrap is set up so it wraps. Then underneath, in the same child container number 2, I've got a grandchild. So child container 2, and then we have the subchild. And inside of there, if we expand, we have a text editor, and I've currently set it to be aligned at the bottom within that child container, so I can move it to the middle or the top. I'm just going to pop it at the bottom. And then I've also got an image, and that is all within the sub-child container because I wanted a particular layout. But again, like what I said above, this is overuse of sub-child containers, because if I now show you that exact same layout down here, it's exactly the same as what we got above, believe it or not. You can measure it if you want. Let's just explore this. Again, parent container, image. This was originally inside of a child container. Now, if I was going to add content over it, so like the text editor button or another image on top of the image or whatever, then having that as a child container made total sense. But this time, I've just dropped in an image and I've made the width of that image in the Advanced tab be 30%, because that's all it needs to be. There's no need for that to be inside of a child container unless I was going to overlap it or add further content. Then I've got my container, which is 70%, which is exactly like what we had above. But the big difference is this does not contain a subchild. If I expand it down here, you'll see text editor 100%, text editor 60%, text editor 30%. Then I've got text editor 30% again, and this time I've got an image. What I've got is some wrapping. So the wrap is 100% a 60-30. This is a 30%, so it only takes up 30% space. And this is an image that only takes up 60% as well. So over here, we had 2 child and 1 subchild. Here we've just got 1 child container. If you draw out what you want, and don't just go, well, I need a container and I'll add another container and a 3rd and 4th and 5th container. If you think methodically, you can massively reduce the amount of containers you actually need. Wake up, I know you've fallen asleep, but now we're going to go and have a look at the grid, because the grid expands and takes things to another level. There will be people debating and there'll be posts on forums and people saying the grid is better than the Flexbox or the other way around. And I don't think there is a right or wrong answer to this. I think it comes down to what do you want to build and what do you want to present. And if you disagree, do stick it in the comments because I totally respect all of you and how you build. But I would say that I tend to use Flexbox Container more than I use Grid, unless the design brief requires me to go for a grid layout. Let me show you the grid and why it can be super useful to use. This is the grid. It basically looks like a Flexbox, right? We've just got 3 items and you might look at that and go, well, yeah, that's just set up to be rows because you've got everything side by side. Let's first look at how you would get it. Make sure you've gone and activated the grid box in your Elementor features. And normally when you go to a brand new page or you hit the plus sign, you will have the option for grid. When you click grid, it's going to give you some layouts. So this is a layout with basically 2 grid boxes within the grid or containers or slots for you to go and drop your content in. This is the same thing, but it's switched the other way around now as a column. This is with 3, 3, 4, and we've got 6. Down here, I already have a layout that I'm going to move on to in a moment. But if I was to go and click this one here, you now have a layout with parent container per se, even though it's called grid. And inside of here, we have 3 slots. If I go over to layout, you'll see it says columns 3, row 1. If I go and change this to be 6, can you see what's going on there? We now have 3 columns and 6 rows. And you don't have to use all of them up, but I'm going to clarify that in a moment. And if you wanted to have more columns, let's go and pop in 20. Why would you do that? But you can do if you want. Let's now focus on what we have. We have a grid. And this is set up to be 3 columns with 2 rows. And inside of each one of these, every time you add in an element, it's going to go to a different box. So I've already got my heading, my icon, and my button. Okay, I'm clicked on the container. I'm going to go to the plus sign, and I'm going to click text editor. It goes to the 4th one. If I go and hit plus sign and I say I want an icon, it goes to the 5th one. So over here, it says container, and it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And if I added in a 6th one, it would go over here. And that's the way the grid works. And I'll drop in a heading. And you know what? I'll add in another text editor. So even though I set this container to be a 3x2, if I show you that, it will add more in. Now, I don't recommend you doing that. Make sure you've gone and decided on your columns and your rows and how many you need. You could have 1 column, 1 row, 100 columns. Again, why would you do that? You know, I split things up into proper sections. But you can add in more than it actually you prescribed at the start, but I would recommend getting it right. Let me just get rid of these just to clarify what you're building here. So every time you add in a new element, it goes over into another box. So if you wanted to have the heading and the icon in the same box, you're not going to be able to do that with the standard grid. I will come on to what you need to do in a moment. Let's just focus on the container, okay? This is set to be a container. You can flick between the Flexbox and the grid if you decide you now want to go to Flexbox. Just bear in mind, though, the moment you do that, things might go a bit funny if you've been very imaginative with what you're building. It might go a bit, try and build correctly when you are building. This is set to be 100% width. I could shrink it down. We'll leave it as 100%. You can modify your heights, and maybe you want to have like a perfect square layout for your grids. You could do that. We are seeing the grid outline. If you don't want to see that, you can get rid of it. We do have the facility to go and set our gaps up, so I could set it up to be 50%. I'm going to leave it as 0. The auto flow decides on how are things added. So every time we added, they were kind of going like that in a row pattern, and then it wrapped onto the next line. If we were to go and set it to be column, it would actually go like a reverse N, reverse Z, reverse N. It's a reverse N. I always have to think about this. Yeah, it's a reverse N. So if I was to now add in another element, like a text editor, it would go here. And if I added in another one, in fact, no, we'll add in a button, it goes like that. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. Whereas if you went with a row, it would be like that. I literally had to just look at the camera to make sure I was doing that right just then. I'm going to leave it as row because I like to work with row quite a lot. Justify item, justify to the start. If you move it to the center, this is now affecting the items inside of each box area. So you can see what it's doing. If you do stretch, it stretches all the way across. Let's leave that at start, center, bottom. And again, if you stretch, it would now stretch to full height. I hope you're understanding that the whole thing with stretch. So if I gave this a background color for the heading, it would now stretch that. In fact, let me just show you what would happen if we did go to the advanced tab and go to background and give this a bit of a color, something like that. That's what the stretch is doing. So if you do it to the justify items as well, you get the idea. Let's now undo that and just put everything to be in the center. Another important aspect is the width of the boxes. First, let me show you what would happen with the items inside and how it might not do what you wanted it to do and how you then have to think about the structure and the layout here. So if I go to my heading and I go and set this to be a custom width and I set this to be custom like that, say 25%, the size of the boxes are the same throughout that entire grid, 3x2. It doesn't matter how small I make that, that is still sat within that particular box area. So let's go back to the container. We have a 3x2. If, however, rather than using the FR unit or fractional unit, I'm going to go and click the pencil here. And you can see it says 1FR, 1FR, 1FR. So what it's doing is, because you've got 3 columns, it's giving them equal weighting in a way, so 1, 1, 1. If I was to go and change this to be 1, 1, 2 FR, watch what happens to the button, okay? Let's change that to be 2. This is now redistributing the gap or the spacing. So we have 1 and 1, so that's 25%, 25%. That's now taking up 50%. If I was to go and change that to be a 5, it starts to redistribute. And if I was to go over here to my pencil, which again is 1FR, 1FR for the way it's done it, let's go and change this one to be 3. And what it does is it redistributes the height of each of those boxes to fit within this formula. So it's saying 75% for the first row, 25% for the second row. And if I was to go and set the height of this to be 500, you could start to do the mathematics of exactly what that means. So I put it back to be what they were originally. What if I want this to occupy 200 pixel? So I'm going to go here, and where it says 1FR, rather than trying to calculate, well, what is it? I'm going to go and type in 200 pixel like that. That is now 200 pixel. And then whatever is remaining within my grid, it redistributes that to be 1FR and 1FR. So if you want to be, again, very prescriptive over the sizing of those boxes, you could do, and you can do the same here as well. So we got 1FR, and I'm going to go and set this to be 200 pixel like that, because I haven't set any height for this container yet. So again, you can overwrite the values you're given by default, or if you want to keep it really simple, just stick to something like this, which sometimes is what a lot of people do prefer. And that's basically Grid. It's pretty simple. You can add in your items and they're going to either go like in reverse N or that pattern where they go in rows. You could drop in a video, further images, an FAQ, you know, there's lots of stuff, and a form, and they're all going to sit side by side. So it's a very particular layout. But what if you wanted to have elements occupying the same box? So let's say you want to have the icon and the heading in the same area, but you don't want to use like an icon box or an icon header. You want to be very particular. This is where you will now drop containers, which is why I wanted to cover off all of the container stuff earlier above about rows, columns, and wrapping. So I could now inside of here drop a container. So let's go and do that. Plus sign, we're going to drop a container. So there we have our grid container that contains everything. Think of it like the parent container. You have your heading, icon button, they're all in their own separate boxes. And then we have a container. And I could pick this heading up and drop it in. I could pick this icon in and drop that in as well. I could go to my container inside of the grid and go, is it going to be column? Is it going to be a row? Am I going to add in a subchild into there? I could do. Am I going to wrap it? I could do. So when you start to understand Flexbox containers and layout, and then you use it with a grid, it can be massively your friend, because at the end of the day, the grid is a bit like a parent. So do you have to use grid? Not necessarily, except where the design is very, very different, and trying to do it with a Flexbox layout is going to like just not work for you. Take this design over here. How would you do this with a Flexbox container? Well, you could have a Flexbox like this, and inside of it you have child container 1, child container 2, and this might be set as a row, so you got a bit of wrap going on, and then you got child container number 3. But then you got this child container here, which now kind of has to break into the second child or sub-child or grandchild. God, I've lost count now of what's happening to this family tree. But can you see this crossover here? Well, that gives us a problem. Well, okay, let's flip the layout. What if we went with this kind of layout so we could do a bit of wrapping and get our content to sit and look a certain way? But now what about this overlap over here? It just doesn't work for us. And this is where the grid, with a bit of spanning between the boxed items, really is your friend. And this is where the grid comes into its own. So I've gone and added in a container and another container. What you first want to decide, though, is how many containers you need. So this grid is currently set to be 3 by 3, because when you look at the layout, you can break it down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. But the amount of containers we need is not going to be 9. It's actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I'm going to go over to my containers and I'm going to add in 5 of them. So container, container, container. There I go. I've got my 5. Looks nothing like that layout at the moment, right? Well, let's sort this out. I'm going to go to my first container, go to the Advanced tab, and I'm actually going to give it a class name. I'm going to call it C1. I'm going to go to container number 2 and call it C2, C3, PO, C4, and my final one, I've called C5. Now, you don't have to do what I'm doing, where I've gone and done it individually to each one, because I'm going to stick our code in the parent container or the grid container. It gets very confusing, right? Because it just has the word container there. But that's the parent for everything that sits inside. And I'm going to drop in a bit of code that's going to allow us to adapt this layout. And there will be a link in the video description for where you can go and get a code snippet that's going to massively help you out with writing this code. What I need you to do is start thinking about the start and end points and the intersecting lines. Because what we're going to do is we're going to span this container here to go from start here and end here, because it needs to be a particular layout. You can see it on the screen. It needs to start here and end here. So you need to think about your start and your end points. We have a grid of 3 by 3. But remember, you got to think about the start point, the intersecting lines, and the end point. So this is your start point, line 1. We have an intersection, line 2. We have another intersection, line 3. And we have the end, line 4. Now, what about the rows? We have the start for 1, 2, 3, get my fingers right, and we have 4 over here as well. The best way to think of it is whenever you have grids and columns, if you got 3 by 3, just add 1, so it's 4 by 4. If it was 2 by 2, you'd have 3 by 3. If it was 1 by 1, it's 2 by 2, because even if this was just one box, completely, you still have 1 and 2, the start and end, 1 and 2. Just add 1 onto it. For that container, I'm going to go to my Advanced tab and I'm going to go to Custom CSS. And then I drop this little bit of code in, and I will pop this in the video description if you want to go and play with it. Now, you will notice that I have got this media screen bit with 768, because the layout you go for, which might look fine when you're on like a tablet or a desktop, you might not really want that to be how it looks on the mobile. Imagine this on a mobile. It's going to look really cramped together. When you get to the mobile view, I recommend you just have them either side by side, as long as you don't have boxes that have too much content, or you have them stacked, which is simple and easy to do when you modify the layout in the mobile. But this particular container, which is called C1, don't worry about the C1 bit. It's when we stick the code into the parent container grid container parent thing. I've just said selector for that container, grid column 1 to 2. So the column starts at 1, ends at 2. And the row starts at 1, ends at 2. Now look at this layout. 1, 2. There's your number 2. We actually want it to go to number 3. So I'm going to go here to where it says the row, start at 1, watch the screen, go to 3. Can you see what it did? And it moved the other 5th container along, because it's now occupying the space of 3 by 3. So if this layout was 5 by 5, these items would probably be over here because they've got the space to fill 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Because we got 3 by 3, and this again goes back to what I said, draw it out. Draw out your layout. Think about, does it need to be in its own container? Could it sit in its own box? What's the layout I want? So back to this. We are now getting the item to fill up more area than what it originally was set up as. So it originally took up 1 box. It's still taking up 1 box, but it's occupying the space of 2 boxes. Let's now go to, let's just copy this code and make it easier for ourselves. Let's go to this child container, which is C2, custom CSS. I'm now going to stick the same code I had before, and this is where it gets a little bit peculiar because it's now occupying the same area. But let's sort that out. Starts at 1 and ends at 2. That's what C1 was doing. Now it needs to start at 2, 3, 4. So let's go with column starts at 2 and ends at 4. Look at it. It's gone all the way across, but it's occupying a bigger area. For row, start at 1 and end at 2. So let's go and shrink that down. Can you see what we're doing here? We would have had eventually a problem if we were starting to work around with Flexbox containers. You could do it with a bit of CSS imagination, but this makes it a whole lot easier for you. Now, box number 3, we can actually leave that one as it is. We don't need to add any code in. We could just leave it. Let's now go to this one here, which is container number 4. Think about your container ordering as well. It might be that you want this one to be number 4. So again, just think about your layout and what's going to go where. Sometimes it's better first to sort out your layout, then drop your content in, because hopefully you've already drawn it all out. So let's go here. Let's drop in our CSS. So this is now going to start at column 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and end at 4. So we're going to go with 3 and we're going to go with 4. And in terms of the height, it's 1, 2, 3, 4. So 2 to 4. So we're now going to say occupy row 2 to 4, and that's what we've got here. And then we go to the final container, which is down here. Again, you may want to swap them over depending on your layout. And we're going to start at 3 and end at 4. And that's how simple it was to get that layout. And you're going to say, that was not simple. Believe me, it is simple. It's a simple little bit of CSS. Now you're going to say, but the height doesn't look quite right because we've got this like empty orphaned container. I mean, we only ever had 5 and we've used up all 5, but this is lingering in this space here. Our parent grid container is set to be 700 width by 700 height because I wanted to have this like almost perfect square-like design going on, even though we have rectangles as well. This is orphaned, and if you go to preview, you're still going to see it. But don't worry about that because even though when you go to preview, it's still there, and it is going to kind of plague your mind a little bit. Once you've published and you view this on a live screen and scroll all the way down, you can see it is perfect square. It is misleading, and there have been times where people then overcompensate for that. So they start to adjust the height of their items to go, oh, I've got to get the perfect square. And then they preview it and go, oh, hold on, now it's too big. So bear that in mind. And now that you got your containers, you can go and style them out and drop in whatever content you want. Bear in mind, though, each one of these is a container. So you can have like column or row or add wrapping in. But you can be imaginative and versatile. But this layout with a Flexbox container on its own is very, very difficult. Okay, you can do it, but it's very, very difficult. But the grid container allows you to achieve that. Now, I've shown you how I've gone and added in some CSS per container. But what if you wanted to do it to the grid? Because I did give them all class names, right? So let me get rid of all of the CSS I've added. All of that hard work gone. And instead, I'm going to go to my parent grid now, or the grid container. We're going to go to the advanced tab and we're going to add in our CSS code here. And there's my code all in one place. So I've stripped them out of each individual container, or that sat within the boxes. I've maintained the class name of C1, C2, C3, C4, C5, and we've got the same layout. And so if you want to do it via your individual containers, you could do, but what makes this easier is that you could drop in a brand new container, give it a class name, and then control everything in one location. Whereas if you add in the CS code per individual box, then you got to go back into each box. But this makes it a little bit easier to work with. I have nothing against grid containers. I just prefer to use Flexbox more unless the design I'm working with requires me to go down the grid layout approach because I want to have a particular layout. Look, I hope you found this interesting. I hope the timelines helped. I'd love to read and hear your comments. I'm Imran from Web Squadron. Go and check out our $1 business packs and loads of other free packs that you can basically get for free. I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye.
Never break. always fight, never quit, do it right, play the game, win it life, have no shame, there's no time, feel the pain, live the grind, I could change, in my mind, pick a lane, commit and climb, the only way to win it life, I never miss, that's fact, taking big swings.